My name is Eleanor Burkin and I've lived here for over 40 years, but I grew up in Wellington, and this is where this gentleman grew up that I'm going to talk about, and his name was Carl Jorgensen. And I knew nothing about him in his early days, but through the information I have on these army records, I've discovered that he trained as a masseur, which is rather an unusual thing for a guy to start training as, one thinks of it in these days. But then I guess he was dealing with injuries and massaging people for crook backs and stuff. But he didn't remain doing that, because the next thing we find out, he was a farmer. And he was up at Matamata, just out of Matamata, farming, when he decided in 1915 that he would go and volunteer to go over on the war effort. So I think it was about July he signed up, and about a month or two later he was on his way on a boat to Gallipoli, and he arrived in Gallipoli, I think, just in November. It says he got to Anzac in November of that year. And if you know anything about Gallipoli, which I don't know a lot about, they actually evacuated out of there a month later, I think, just after Christmas. And well, I'm really here to talk about this leaf, because at that point he was in the ambulance corps, and the reason why he was joining the ambulance corps is, I think, that the army was so shocked about having so many people who had died, and I mean there must have been just hundreds of people dying and being injured, that they must have sent back and said, please, we want people to help with medical stuff. And because he was a masseur, they said, oh right, you can be in that. And so that's how he got into it. And of course when he arrived in Gallipoli, I suppose the worst of it was over, but Christmas was coming up, and Carl, and I'm sure he wasn't the only one who did this, found a leaf. I don't know where the leaf came from, because I understood that the hillsides were devastated and there were no trees left. But he found a leaf and he wrote on it, to Uncle Albert, who was my grandfather, from Carl. And on the other side it says, unfortunately you can't read it very well, Christmas 1915 Gallipoli. And so this leaf came from the battlefields of Gallipoli, and it was in an envelope, and I found it after my mother died in a big trunk under the house. Nobody else had bothered to look in this trunk, but my husband sighted the trunk and said, before her whole house was sort of sold up, oh, let's take this and have a look at it. So there were all sorts of stuff in the trunk, and inside a book there was a little envelope, and inside the envelope was that leaf, and I was absolutely gobsmacked. And I just held this thing and thought, I can't believe it, this came from Gallipoli. So we put it back in the envelope and put it into the book again, and a few years later I decided, look, I've got to do something with this. So I researched who could I get to, save the thing, and somebody in Auckland did something with medals and whatnot, some private firm. So I went up to them and said, listen, can you tell me, I think it needs to go between glass because there's two sides to it. Oh yes, they said, we'll do it. So I got it back. But to go back to the story of Carl, they were evacuated from Gallipoli at the end of 1915, and he went to Alexandria or Cairo. Now I didn't know a lot about this, but all the troops landed up in Cairo, and I suspect they had to go somewhere and they didn't know where to go, so Cairo was quite near, so right, let's go to Cairo. And Carl, being in the ambulance corps, wouldn't have had a lot to do, and he was shoved around all over the place. Every few days he went somewhere else. He was admitted to somewhere on the 9th, and then on the 11th he went somewhere else, Ismailia, Alexandria, Cairo. I think they didn't know what to do with him, because he was supposed to be looking after dead and injured people, and they'd all gone by then. So the next move for Carl was that off he went to the Western Front, which is where I think it must have been absolutely dreadful for him. because he was stationed at what are called CCS, Casualty Clearing Stations, on the Western Front, and he landed it, and it just says here Havre, and I think it must be Le Havre. I have no idea where in France he went to, but it was obviously on the Western Front. And there was Carl, and I think the casualty clearing stations must have been quite close to the front line, and there was Carl dealing with these wounded people who were arriving, and Carl was supposed to be doing something about it. I don't think he had any medical training at all, except for what he was, what he picked up. And he was at various casualty clearing stations, and at one stage he was with the Australians, which quite surprised me. It was at an AUS clearing station. And then he, at the end of the war, he went to England, and he must have decided by this time he didn't know what he was going to do next. So he thought, well, maybe he'd have something to do with people's feet. And so he became what do you call them? Podiatrist. And he went to train as a podiatrist. First of all, he went, I think it was, to Wales, but then he came back about 2 days later. That was a wrong move, and then off he went to something called the orthopaedic hospital in Hornchurch, where he must have learnt how to deal with whatever it was for people's feet. He came back to New Zealand in 1919 at the age of 30. He was 25 when he joined up, and I remember him, and this is his photograph here. You can see the photograph there. And I remember him as an old man. He came to my parents' house, and my mother had them for a cup of tea in the front room, and he was a very quiet, subdued little man, and he had married late in life to a woman called Evelyn, and Evelyn did all the talking, and Carl just sat there and hardly said a word, and Carl looked as though it had taken the most dreadful toll on him. I mean, I didn't know anything about this as a child, but the thing about him is that we have got this photograph and one other, and in both photographs he is not looking at the camera, which I think says quite a lot. And probably if somebody had said to him, look at the camera, this is my own opinion, he would have thought, no, I can't look at anything else, and I'm not going to look at it, because he'd been asked to look at so much. And I thought that was very revealing. That's the story.
It's lovely. And so you just remembered maybe that one visit?
2 or 3, but he never spoke. He was just absolutely crushed.
Yeah, his experiences must have been horrible.
Dreadful.
And how, do you know if he commemorated Anzac Day at all? Or?
Well, I was too young as a child. I wouldn't know that.
Yeah.
I have the feeling he might not have. I don't know. I wouldn't know about that. But he was a person who was just so reserved and shy, and that was it.
And when did you find the leaf? Do you know what year that was?
Yes, I do. My mother died in the year 2000, and we had to clear out the things in her house, and I went under the house with my husband, and there was this terrifically old trunk. It was just sort of crumbling away, and inside it were all my grandfather's possessions that he wanted to keep. You know, his wife had died when he was, when my mother was 3, and he had all of the death, the people, oh, poor dear Albert, we're so sorry you've lost your wife, and had 4 little girls, and there were all the sort of black-edged sympathy letters. And my grandfather was a lawyer in Wellington, and he brought up the children with the aid of a housekeeper, so there's a bit of tragedy in the family.
Absolutely, it must have been very hard on him.
Yes, and this young man, Carl, he lived just a few doors away in Kilburnie in Wellington, and that's where he went back to live after he came back from the war.
Did he have any children?
No, he married Evelyn quite late, and never any children, no.
Yeah. And you didn't know about the Gallipoli leaf?
No, not until we opened the trunk.
Any idea what tree it's from?
No, I would love to know. It's quite a thick, fleshy leaf.
We need a botanist.
Yes. You can sort of see it's quite, well, that's 100 years old, that leaf. And it still survived. It hasn't sort of cracked up or anything.
And do you know if anything else survived from his war years, or?
No, not really, no. I only have the record that I downloaded from the archives, and that's where I've learnt most about him. I mean, I was absolutely astonished to find he'd been farming not too far away. I had no idea that he'd been in Matamata, and I even know the road where he was, so I must go and have a look at that road. Somebody said it's a very straight road and they do burnouts down there now.
That'll be interesting.
Just out of Matamata, Taihoa or something it's called.
And so no medical training at all apart from...
Not to my knowledge, no. I think they were just desperate for guys to, you know, anybody who looked as though they had any hands-on knowledge about anything. That's what I think. I can't think of any other reason why he wouldn't have been sent to the front. Because they'd had horrendous casualties at that point, so they were looking for people to drag them off the hillsides.
Thank you so much for sharing that story with us
Pleasure.
and for bringing